Hello, this is Chuck. Excuse me as I adjust things here. Okay, we're reading part 6, Hell Unleashed. This might be another long chapter. So let's get started if I can get to the page right. 52. It had been a long day. First the press conference, then other questions, individual interviews. The first one he tried with Ada at his side, but her obsession with the ghost of her mother made her come off as a nut. For the others, he tried to stick to the basics. Yes, there was an alien artifact that they had dubbed the Marker. Yes, it had been found at the heart of the Chicxulub crater under layers of rock, which suggested that it might well be older than human life. No, this was not a hoax. Yes, he was convinced that the military was trying to cover up the existence of the Marker. What the rest of the government did or did not know, he couldn't say. He did not bring up the hallucinations. He wanted to avoid the notion that the Marker was sentient, and in any case, he wasn't sure that the hallucinations really came from the Marker. Maybe they were simply triggered by it. He didn't talk about the strange creature on the beach, or show them the sign of the tail of the devil, or tell them that the Yucatan Maya believed the devil's tail was deep beneath the waves, just where the Marker had been found. Most media outlets, he quickly realized, saw him as an interesting curiosity, an extremist whom they could parade before their viewers and listeners. They were more interested in poking holes in his stories. Couldn't the vid be faked? How did they know it was actually the size he said it was? Size could be simulated on a vid, and there were no human figures in the vid to compare it to. Hadn't he gone to Chicxulub to work on the university research grant? Then how was it he had ended up working for the military, living on this alleged floating island? Didn't that sound a little too much like something out of a sci-fi novel? But there were a few people who asked more serious questions, and once he had answered, they looked at him in a different, more thoughtful way. They arrived at the historic Watergate Hotel late, past midnight. There was another round of interviews the next day, requests still coming in over the phone. Also a meeting with a lawyer about possibly filing an injunction against the government. Public opinion seemed to be building. Maybe it would be enough to apply the right amount of pressure on the places that needed it. It's going to work, Ada said as he opened the door. Markov won't be able to keep the Marker for himself. Everybody will know about it now. Everyone will have a chance to share in its message. Not knowing what to say, he didn't answer. They opened the door. He flipped on the light and then stopped dead. One of the walls had a large hole in it, plaster scattered all about the floor. Just behind it, sitting in a chair beside the bed, was Markov. "Hello, Altman," he said. Altman started to turn toward the door, but found a gun with a silencer on its end pointed at his eye. Another pointed at Ada's chest. Krax was holding one, a guard he didn't recognize the other. There were two more guards deeper in the room. They came forward now. "I don't need to tell you that I'll shoot your girlfriend first." "No screaming," said Krax. "Nothing but polite silence unless you are spoken to. Do you understand?" Altman nodded. "Move into the room," he said. "Get on the bed." They moved in, were pushed onto the bed. Krax stepped back and sat in a chair that he'd set up across the threshold of the bathroom, keeping his gun trained at Altman. "I take it you've seen the press conference?" said Altman. "Shut up, Altman," said Markov. "Nobody likes a smartass." "It's too late, Markov," hissed Ada. "Word is out." Markov ignored her. "Let's have a little talk, Altman," he said. Talking can't hurt, can it?" Altman didn't say anything. "I don't suppose we could encourage you to drop everything," Markov said. Hold another press conference. Let them know that you were only joking, that there is no marker, that there is no conspiracy, that you've been the victim of an incredible hoax. No, said Altman. If you do, said Markov, we could come to some sort of arrangement. You'd be allowed to come back to research the marker. When Altman didn't say anything, he added, with total access. Total access? It was tempting, but no doubt Markov was lying. And in any case, he was far enough along that there was no going back. The marker had to be investigated openly. He doesn't want to answer to you, said Ada. He answers only to the marker. Ada, please. Markov reached out, cuffed her hard. Shut up, he said. Don't touch her, said Altman. What's your answer, Altman? Asked Markov. I'm sorry, said Altman. No. I'm sorry too, said Markov. That's it then. You're going to have to come with us. I don't think so, said Altman. We're not asking you if you want to come or not. We're giving you the choice between coming or dying. Then kill me, said Altman without hesitation. Markov looked at him coolly. Call me superstitious, but I think that marker has something in store for you. I don't want to kill you yet. Markov nodded toward Ada, and Crack's gun slowly swiveled until it was pointed at Ada's head. I don't have the same reservation about your girlfriend. Altman looked over at Ada. She didn't look afraid, but it was that very fact that made him afraid. She was eager to die a martyr. So the choice is either both of us go with you, or I just go, he said. Markov smiled. Got it in one, he said. Cracks here has a sedative for both of you. He gestured to the others. These fine boys will repair the hole we made, make everything as good as new. As far as anybody knows, you simply got cold feet and disappeared. You're a real bastard, said Altman. Takes one to know one, said Markov. Now be a good boy and take your medicine. 53. And so Altman was back where he started, though also a little surprised that they hadn't simply killed him. He suspected a trap, something awful they were saving for him, but didn't know what it would be. He wondered if his press conference or his disappearance following it had any effect. He doubted he'd be able to find out while inside the floating compound. As for Ada, when he awoke from the drug, she was gone. When he demanded to see her, they just laughed. She'll be safe, Cracks had said, as long as you cooperate. A few hours after waking up, still a little groggy, he had found himself in Stevens' office. The latter sat with his elbows resting on the arms of his chair and his fingers tented in front of his face. Why am I here? Altman asked. Why am I still alive? Markov is curious about you, Stevens admitted. Curious? You have some resistance to the effect of the marker, a resistance that most of your colleagues don't have. Markov realizes you might be of use for his project. And what project is that? Stevens smiled. You can understand why he might wonder about you, he said. You survived trips in the bathyscaphe that have driven other people mad. Even when you've had headaches and hallucinations, they haven't caused you to degenerate into violence or madness the way so many of the other hallucinators seem to do. Many of the believers on board have an almost religious awe of you. And I have to say that I find myself half sharing their belief. I suspect that a few of my colleagues feel similarly. That's insane, said Altman. They think you're a reluctant prophet, said Stevens. Altman shook his head. The marker is dangerous, he said. I'm sure of it. And yet you're fascinated by it, said Stevens. He leaned forward. We still suspect you know things that you're not telling. He opened his desk drawer and removed from it the chunk of rock from the marker. This was found in your jacket pocket while you were unconscious, he said. Care to explain? No, said Altman. Stevens nodded. Up to you, he said. If you don't want to explain to me, perhaps you can speak with Cracks. But Cracks didn't seem to want to talk exactly. You know why you're here? He asked. Altman nodded. You want to know about the chunk of the marker. That's part of it, he said. He led Altman to a chair with leather straps affixed to the arms and legs. Sit here, he said. Why? Said Altman. Where's Ada? Don't worry about Ada. Just sit, said Cracks, pushing his chest lightly so he tipped back into the chair. Now I'm going to strap you in, he said. There's no need to strap me in, said Altman, panic starting to rise in him. I'll stay as I am. Cracks shook his head and began affixing the straps. You won't, he said. I'm afraid, Mr. Altman, that this is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. What do you mean, a bumpy ride? How do they feel? Cracks asked as he tested each strap in turn. Not uncomfortable? Not too tight? I'm fine, said Altman. But what? Cracks pulled the left wrist strap painfully tight, then the right. He could feel the strap cutting deep into his flesh. How about now? He asked. And then he left the room. For a moment, Altman was alone, straining against the straps, and then he stopped. Maybe he could tip the chair over, break it somehow. But when he tried to rock it back and forth, he found that it had been bolted to the floor. A moment later, Cracks was back, bringing a wheeled cart with him. On top of the cart was a tray covered in a white cloth. Cracks brought it close, pulled the cloth off with a flourish. Beneath was a row of scalpels and knives, a pair of pincers as well. Cracks ran his hand slowly over them. You didn't think you could just waltz off and report on us and suffer no consequences, did you, Mr. Altman? Altman tried to speak, but his mouth had gone suddenly dry. Cracks selected the smallest knife. Let's start small and work our way up, shall we? He said. I'd rather you didn't, said Altman. Just a few small cuts at first, Mr. Altman. Just something to make it interesting and to make you respect my artistry. He grabbed hold of Altman's index finger and very carefully cross-hatched the tip of it. The knife just cutting through. At first, it didn't hurt, just felt warm. And then the finger began to throb, a drop of blood forming on the tip. He went on to the next finger, and then the next. Just 3 or 4 small cuts per finger, hardly deeper than paper cuts. Altman watched a drop of blood collect at the end of each finger, the hand feeling like it was on fire. We're going to be here for days and days, Mr. Altman. We'll get to know each other very intimately. He left the room again. Altman tried to not look at the hand, tried to ignore its throbbing, but he couldn't help it. Before it was all over, it would, he knew, become much, much worse. He'd wish he were dead. And then Cracks was back, a bowl full of salt in one hand. Have you heard the expression rubbing salt into a wound, Mr. Altman? Altman felt his hand clench involuntarily. He closed his eyes. Cracks slapped him. You'll want to watch this, he said, but Altman kept his eyes closed. Suddenly his hand was burning, his fingers being ground into the salt. He couldn't help but gasp. He clenched his eyes tighter. Fine-grained salt works best, Cracks explained in a calm voice. Sea salt in particular. Iodized, of course. Cracks released the hand. That's it, he said. You can open your eyes. He did. The light in the room seemed abnormally bright through the pane. What do you want to know? Asked Altman through gritted teeth. All in good time, said Cracks. No need to rush things. He returned to the cart, placing the bowl of salt on it. He replaced the small knife, ran his hands over the knives that remained. I love my job, said Cracks, smiling, and then plucked a slightly larger knife from the tray and came toward him. Open wide, he said. Markov was alone on the command deck, standing in his usual spot. To someone coming in, it might look like he was staring out through the observation window and into the dark water. What he was really doing was monitoring a series of holovids set up to be seen only from that one position. They showed various parts of the ship, cycling rapidly between them. Something was up, he could tell. A disturbance in the marker chamber. Stay with that, he said, and one of the holovids dedicated itself exclusively to that chamber. Lots of guards and scientists shaking fists. Where was Cracks? He was supposed to keep shit like this from happening, and then he remembered Cracks was with Altman and smiled. The door slid open and Stevens stepped in. He stood there a few tiers down, waiting, until Markov gestured him forward. We got problems, admitted Stevens. Tell me something I don't already know, said Markov. The believers are getting restless. Somehow they know Altman is back on board. They're demanding to see him. Absolutely not, said Markov. I've given him to Cracks to play with. If we don't let him make an appearance, we're likely to have another riot on our hands. Besides, Cracks has already found out enough. He knows where he got the chunk of the marker and how. It didn't take long for Altman to give that up. I've watched the vids, had Altman's micro-expressions analyzed. I don't think Cracks is likely to get much more out of him. Stevens came a little closer, put his hand on Markov's shoulder. I know you hate him, he said. We all hate him, but we can use him. Markov just shrugged the hand off. He'll be a distraction to the believers, Stevens said. He'll be more useful to us that way than he is dead. Markov focused his hard stare fully on Stevens. Stevens met it placidly. How do I know you're not one of them? One of whom? The believers? Do I seem like a believer to you? All right, Markov said. He can be useful. Get him from Cracks. But if anything goes wrong, I'm blaming you. In the middle of the sixth knife, 2 guards showed up. He was released suddenly and without warning, hands and feet sore and bleeding, cuts on his back and thighs, but basically in one piece. We'll see each other again soon, Cracks promised. The guards bandaged him and hustled him down to Stevens, left the 2 of them alone. It would have been easier to tell me, said Stevens. Keep that in mind next time you have a choice. Screw you, said Altman. Stevens smiled. I can send you back to Cracks any time, he said. Keep that in mind as well. Altman didn't reply. The only reason you're here now, Stevens said, is because I have a use for you. There was a skirmish between believers and unbelievers the other day that left people dead. People are taking sides. If it goes on like this, more people will die. I'd like to keep that from happening. I think you can help. How? The believers trust you, he said. They may listen to you. The pulse signal is broadcasting again, said Altman. The conflict between the believers and the unbelievers is hardly your biggest problem. No, admitted Stevens, but the 2 feed one another. You're here instead of with Cracks and his knives because Markov thinks you may have a chance of keeping things stable. And if I say no? Stevens shrugged. Then you go back to Cracks. And if you misbehave or try to stir the believers up, I'll shoot you myself. But keep things stable and you'll prevent a lot of people ending up dead. And it goes without saying that we'll be watching you at all times. I want to talk to Ada first, said Altman. Stevens hesitated for a moment. No, he finally said. Why not? You'll have to trust me that she's safe, said Stevens. If everything goes well, I'll let you talk to her. Field was there. Many other scientists he recognized as well, all of them happy to see him again. It was Field who told him about the firefight with the military, the deaths. He showed him, too, where he had been shot in the foot, but didn't remove the dressing. That must hurt, said Altman. Field smiled happily. Without the morphine, I wouldn't be able to walk, he said. But that's not important, he said. I'm not important. Of course you are, said Altman, patting him on the shoulder as if he was crazy. Field shook his head. What's important is that things have begun to change. A lot of us are dead now, and a lot of us are crazy. Those of us who are left have a different perspective. He clutched Altman by the shirt, pulled him closer, the weird morphine smile still plastered clown-like across his face. Those of us who are left, he said in a stage whisper, believe. If you say so, said Altman, trying to free himself. It's the marker, said Field. It talks to us. He gave Altman a searching look. It spoke to you too. That makes you a believer. It's separating the sheep from the goats. Either you believe or you die. That's crazy, said Altman. Is it? Said Field. Look how many people are dead now. Look how many are mad. Is that normal? Can you explain it any other way? There are other explanations, said Altman. There have to be. Like what? Asked Field. When Altman didn't answer, he said, Be one with the marker, Altman. Accept its message of oneness and unity. Join with us. Finally, he let go. Altman took a step back, trying not to reveal to Field how disturbed he actually was. Mad or dead or religious, what the hell kind of choice was that? More and more people believe in our unitology, Field said with his same mad smile. He reached clumsily into the neck of his shirt, grasped the leather thong. He tugged it out. At the end was a crude sigil, 2 slivers of metal twisted together to form a representation of the marker. When we are weak, said Field, we call on this. He wrapped it in his fist and squeezed it, then closed his eyes, whispering something over and over again, a ritual, chant, or prayer, soft enough that Altman couldn't quite make it out. He didn't want to make it out. He looked away from Field and saw that most of the others around them were doing the same thing, each holding something and whispering towards their clenched fists. Their eyes closed. Slowly and quietly, he shuffled his way free of the group and got the hell out of there. His interactions with the researchers were radically different than they had been before. Before, there had been a separation between Markov's inner circle and the rest of the scientists. Now, everybody seemed inclined to work together. There was a new sense of urgency, a sense largely from the hallucinations, or visions as the believers called them, that time was of the essence. For the first day or two, he just listened. Researcher after researcher approached him, telling him what they'd been able to discover. Most of them had faces lit with zeal, either religious zeal or the zeal of discovery. Either way, it scared him. As he listened, started seeing data from the test, and began to interact directly with the marker itself, he became convinced that he'd been right to begin with, that the marker had a purpose that had nothing to do with the good of humanity. Though what that purpose was, he was still unable to say. Lying in bed at night alone, wondering where Ada was and whether she was still wrapped up in the madness of the marker, he turned it over in his head, becoming more and more worried. All the talk of convergence and everlasting life that had started with the hallucinations was not so much a lie as it was something related to the marker trying to express itself in human means, manipulating the imprinted memories of loved ones and conforming to their words. But what was that something? The marker itself? The beings that had created it? Some sort of protective mechanism? Something else entirely? And whatever it was, something was being lost in the translation. Nobody was sure what the marker wanted from them. Becoming more and more nervous, he opened a vidlink to Stevens. Despite the late hours, Stevens did not look like he'd been woken up. His voice, when he spoke, was as mellifluous as always. Altman, he said, not a hint of surprise in his voice. What can I do for you? You're awake? Don't sleep much these days, said Stevens, too busy talking to the dead. I have something I need to talk over, he said. It's about the marker, about the messages it seems to be sending through hallucinations. I don't know who else to ask. Go ahead, said Stevens. I've been thinking about it myself. I wonder about its purpose. I don't know that we should trust it. Go on. I think we've read what the marker says positively because we are prone to believe in a life beyond this one and because it speaks to us through voices of people we are close to. Fair enough, said Stevens. Clearly it wants us to think of it in a positive light. But if you listen closely to what the hallucinations are saying and try to think of them as being the words of an alien presence channeled through human memories, and try to forget that you're being told them by someone you know and love, there's another interpretation for convergence, for becoming one. Yes, said Stevens. What if convergence means not eternal life or transcendence, but radical subordination? What if it means unity more literally, the destruction of the individual to larger communal self? Like the way some insect colonies function, said Stevens. The individuals all subject to the will of the colony, a kind of hive mind in control of all the individuals. Yes, said Altman. Maybe even more extreme. What if it's being literal? What if it means somehow to transform us from many creatures into one? That doesn't sound feasible, said Stevens. This is new territory, said Altman. We hardly know what's feasible and what's not. In any case, it's dangerous. We may not be heading for utopia, but instead towards destruction. Which raises an important question, said Stevens quietly. What's that? Whatever we're looking for from the marker, whether we see it as something to be mined for power or something to be worshipped or an object of scientific inquiry, are we using the marker or is the marker using us? For the first time, Stevens' smooth exterior broke, and Altman saw something like a glimmer of anxiety burst through. He covered his eyes with his hand. When after a moment he moved his hand away, the smooth exterior had returned. One other thing, said Stevens. The dead talk to some about unity, others about a ticking clock. What does this refer to? How does it relate to convergence? Is the marker awakening now to punish us for not making the most of our time here? I don't know, said Altman. It may be something less threatening, but I think it might be more. The dead act as though we have been facing a deadline that we have inevitably crossed. Convergence is talked about as starting over, but I don't know that it's likely to be a fresh start for us. Maybe it'll be just a fresh start for the marker or whatever controls it. Maybe convergence means wiping us out to start out some new cycle, some new phase of whatever strange process we seem to be a part of. If you're right, said Stevens, the human race is on the brink of extinction. Either way, this convergence represents the end of life as we know it. Yes, said Altman. So what do we do? We should stop it. It should be stopped, Altman said. But I don't know how. Now that's active, I don't think it would help to simply sink the marker again. We have to satisfy it enough to make it fall silent and leave us alone for a while, but not enough to move completely forward into convergence. I don't know what else to do but try to keep understanding what it's saying to us before it's too late. Maybe once we understand what it's saying, we can figure out how to talk to it. But maybe you're wrong, said Stevens. The marker may actually be promising us eternal life. Ullman nodded. I may be wrong, he said, but I don't think I am. You told me yourself. Suicides are up, violent crimes are up. Some people's headaches are so bad that they try to stop them by banging their heads against the wall until it cracks open. All the infirmary beds are filled, and there are still people screaming with nowhere to go. Once respectable scientists are painting their walls with their own shit. Does that sound like eternal life to you? Stevens sighed. It could be just an intermediate stage. Do you know Pascal's wager? He asked. Who's that? Who's what? Asked Altman. Blaise Pascal, said Stevens. 17th century philosopher, mostly forgotten now, though one of the first ships destroyed in the moon skirmishes was named after him. His wager argues that since the existence of God cannot be determined through reason, an individual should live as he did exist, since he has very little to lose if God does not exist, and everything to gain if he does. So what does that have to do with? I'm getting to that, said Stevens. I can either believe what you're telling me, or I can believe that the marker has our best interests at heart. If I believe what you're telling me, then that means that most likely humanity is a lost cause anyway, and I'll spend my final days beating my head out over a problem that can't be solved. If I believe the marker has our best interests at heart, then I move forward full of hope towards my own salvation. Oh my God, you've become a true believer, said Altman. Why else do you think I convinced Markov to have you released? I have to wish you the best of luck, said Stevens. If you're right and I'm wrong, I hope you can figure it out and save all of us. If you're wrong and I'm right, then I have everything to gain by believing. That's not how belief works, said Altman. You can't just decide to believe. Apparently you can't, said Stevens, but I can. I hope you're wrong. Altman watched him reach out and cut the link. Stevens' attitude, Altman realized, was likely to be shared by many, though very few would be rational sounding or as coherent in the way they managed to deliberately shut their eyes to the danger. By raising it with his colleagues, he risked their resentment and even their attacks. Even if they believed him, it might well mean that panic and fear and depression might compromise their ability to work. No, he was going to have to make a little gambit of his own. Altman's wager. He'd wager that he could pretend to proceed as if he agreed, pretend to move forward with fulfilling the marker's will, and then, at the last minute, once he'd learned enough to defeat it, turn things around. If he won, then life would probably continue on as roughly as it was. If he lost, then he'd probably be dead, and maybe everyone else would be as well. Not good odds, but they were the only odds he had. '54. It was Showalter who made the initial breakthrough by suggesting a possible function for the marker. The symbols, he theorized, were mathematical codes that symbolized DNA. The marker itself was a representation of a DNA sequence. The scientists set about decoding the sequence. Another scientist, a radio astronomist named Grote Guth, made the next breakthrough, suggesting that the marker's signal could be read as a transmission of a sequence of genetic code. Field made sure that Altman heard about both. Showalter's team sequenced the marker itself and came up with a genetic profile that was, so he told Altman, remarkably similar to that of humans. So something like humans? Said Altman. Maybe, said Showalter. Maybe even something exactly like humans. I think that the marker has the DNA code for our ancestors. So it records our genetic code, said Altman. So what? It's not just records, said Showalter. We think the pulse transmits it as well, deliberately changing genetic structure slightly in existing human organisms. It may, in fact, have been the beginning of human life. Altman didn't know what to say. It was staggering to think that human life had neither evolved naturally nor been a gift from God, but was, instead, based on the marker. But why would it be rebroadcasting our genetic code? Asked Altman. We've already evolved. What would be the point of that? Have you talked to Groot Guth? Asked Showalter. He's hit a snag. For God's sakes, go to talk to Groot. And so he did. The German scientist was not what he expected he would be. He was small and very thin, and had a skin condition that had left him hairless. He looked harmless, almost helpless. He seemed to be expecting Altman. Yes, he said. Here, Dr. Field has told me about you. You are one of us, yes? Altman neither nodded nor shook his head, but, by the way, I do not know how to pronounce this guy's last name, so I'm sorry about that. But Guth went on. You want to know about the pulse, he said. Whether my team has decoded the pulse, perhaps Herr Dr. Schowalt has said something, yes? Yes, said Altman. We have decoded the pulse, perhaps, but we have struck a complication. What's the complication? Sorry, I don't know why this accent. My team has decoded the signal, and we think it is decoded correctly. We understand it to be a code, and we understand what that code is. Here, Dr. Schowalt thinks he has decoded the signal, and he too thinks it is decoded correctly. The complication is that we have different answers. For him, it is a code that is a step upon the sequence to human life. For me, it is something else entirely, not correlatable to a known species. I am making a synthetic version of mine now to get a closer look at it. Perhaps one of you is wrong, said Altman. Perhaps, said Guth. Perhaps the pulse signal is transmitting a different code than is recorded on the marker. He leaned forward and gave Altman a steady look. I must say something to you, he said. I am a believer. You must not doubt my belief. But I am also a scientist. I have looked carefully at Herr Dr. Schowalter's calculations, and I have looked carefully at my own. Our calculations are correct. If the marker was the beginning of human life, then it has no need to be broadcasting this now. And yet it is communicating a pulse, one with an unfamiliar genetic code. Perhaps it is communicating a pulse, but perhaps it is a flawed pulse with a flawed genetic code. Perhaps this marker has begun a process of deterioration. The convergence, said Altman. But maybe it has simply become confused, said Guth. You must try to understand it. We must work with it. But what if this is what it's meant to do, said Altman. Guth groped his necklace out of his shirt, clutched the icon of the marker in his fist. No, you cannot intend this, he insisted. The marker is here for us. It has simply become confused. And he looked at Altman for guidance. Altman just nodded and left without another word. Surrounded by madmen, he couldn't help but think. Fanatics. But later that night, he began to have doubts. What if Guth was right? What if the marker was just broken? Maybe they could fix the marker by returning the core sample to its rightful position. That's ridiculous, he thought. It was transmitting its signal before the core sample was taken. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling until another idea came to him. But maybe it was transmitting a different signal then, the correct signal. He couldn't sleep until he at least tried. He woke up Showalter, explained what he wanted to do. Already been tried, said Showalter. Doesn't make a difference. But maybe the missing piece isn't crucial, Showalter explained. In fact, no single piece is crucial. The marker is a complex but internally replicated structure in the same way, for instance, that the pattern of a nautilus replicates even as it tightens. Even if part of it are broken or damaged, it still works. Probably the only way to stop it from working would be to pulverize it. Depressed, Almond went back to bed. Chalk went up for the marker. Not damage, or at least not damage in a way they could understand, which meant it must be acting the way it was for other reasons. Either it was working for their own good, or for their destruction. "55. Herr Dr. Guth had been up for hours. With the help of his team, he sequenced the genetic strand and then had it biotically assembled by a nanosystem. Then he meticulously gone over the results to make sure it was right. It was rough, hardly the kind of job that he would be proud of, but it was accurate. If he could get it to replicate, he'd be able to make some extrapolations about the original strand, about the purpose of the mutation. And this might in turn tell him if the marker was broken or if it was working intentionally. His team had stuck with him around the clock until the moment when they'd injected the sequence within a proxy nucleus into 4 dozen embryonic sheep cells, followed by chemical encouragement to get them to divide. After that, there was nothing to do but wait. Either it would work or it would not. For the first time in several hours, he looked around at his team, saw that they were haggard and frazzled by turns, some of them barely standing, so he sent them to bed. Herr Dr. Guth had intended to go to bed himself, only he wasn't tired. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he'd been tired. He hadn't slept for days, and so he had stayed on, alone, in the laboratory. He waited motionless, sitting on his stool. He felt as though he had entered a completely different state of mind, one that did not need sleep. He expected never to have to sleep again. This, he was sure, was due to the marker. Upon thinking the word, he pulled the necklace out of his shirt and clutched the icon in his fist. Would she come? If he thought hard enough, would she come? And then she stepped out of the wall and toward him. At first, she was no more than a blur, but as he squeezed the charm and concentrated, she began to change. The shadowy air around her was cut away, and she became herself. Tall, thin, a perfect face save for one small scar just above her left cheekbone. "I missed you," she said. "I missed you too," he said. She smiled, and a little blood dripped out of her mouth. But not too much. He tried to ignore it. Except for the blood, he loved the way she smiled. "What are you doing?" she asked. "An experiment," he said. "I'm trying to understand the thing that brought you back to life." "How flattering," she said. "But I wish you wouldn't." "I wish I would have spoken to you then," he said, "back when you were alive. I watched you, you know. I followed you everywhere." "I know," she said. "And then you died, and I thought I had missed my chance. But now you're here again." "I'm just a projection of your mind," she said. "You know that. You told me that yourself. You know that I am a construct made from your memories." "I know," he said. "But you seem so real." She smiled wider this time, and blood began to slip down her cheek into her chin. He had found her like that 20 years before. He hadn't even known her name. Then as now, he was unsure of what had happened to her. Then she was as good as dead when he found her. Now she kept dying, but kept being brought back to life again. "You mustn't," she started, and then she slowly faded and was gone. He sighed. He never got much farther with the message the marker sent, never heard as much of it as his colleagues had. He figured it was because of his desire to see the girl was too strong, too intense. He took a look in the cooker, was surprised to see all 40 cells and all 40 receptacles had multiplied. That was unprecedented. Also unprecedented was the speed with which they multiplied. He had never seen anything like it. It had only been a few hours, and already the sample was visible to the naked eye. He stayed for the next hour, watching them until each of the receptacles was teeming with a pale pink substance like nothing so much as biological tissue. Should he take a closer look? Why not? There were plenty of samples. What would it hurt to look at just one? He opened the receptacle, ran a mild electric charge through it. The pinkish substance withdrew as if it felt it. Maybe it did. He upturned the receptacle, poured it onto the table. The substance lay there, undulating slightly. Carefully, he cut it in half with a scalpel. He watched an empty furrow appear between the two halves, then watched the substance run back together again into a single sheet, leaving no visible line or scar. Marvelous, he thought. He was still experimenting with it when his grandmother's face appeared, hovering just over the counter. Startled, he jumped. Sure, he loved his grandmother, but not nearly as much as he loved the girl. Or maybe it was just different. He had known the girl for only a moment, and so his love for her was pure and unadulterated. His feelings towards his grandmother were much more complex. After his parents died, she had taken him in. She had treated him all right, but she was old and grumpy, and sometimes she did things that he had a hard time understanding. And then one day, when he was a little older, she had simply disappeared. Even then, he basically understood that something must have happened to her, something that she couldn't help, that perhaps she had even been killed. But a part of him had a hard time not resenting her for not coming back. What do you want? He asked in German. Is that any way to treat your grandmother? She said. She was speaking in a heavily accented English, even though he knew that if she had been real, she would be screeching in German. I'm sorry, he said. You come, I imagine, because there was something the girl was unable to express. You know I love her. That's more like it, she said, and held out to him a cellophane-wrapped sweet. A cellophane-wrapped sweet. She had always been doing that when she was alive. He tried to take it, but his hand met empty air. It's time, she said. You've learned too much. It's time. Time for what? He hadn't felt whole since he lost his grandmother, and now she was here again, but not here at the same time. He could see her and hear her, but not touch her or smell her. His whole life had been like that, a life of loss. First his parents gone, and then his grandmother. In the end, all that was left was just his laboratory, the only thing he could count on. His laboratory had never let him down. Are you listening to me? She asked, snapping her fingers. Do you understand what I'm saying? You must stop this research at once. Stop his research? He felt a rage rising in him. She had never understood what he was trying to do, so why should it surprise him that she didn't understand him now? But I'm doing important work, he said. I'm making discoveries beyond human imagination. What you are doing is dangerous, she said. Trust me, child. Trust me, child. I say this for your own good. The marker will destroy you. You must stop before it's too late. His eyes were singing with tears. Stop his work? What else did he have? It's not really her, he told himself. The marker had just borrowed her image and voice. Why couldn't it have stayed with being the girl? He had loved her, but never really had her. So he couldn't miss her in the same way that he missed his grandmother. And now it was trying to manipulate him, trying to use his grandmother to get him to stop. "Please go away," he said, trying not to look at her. "It's too much." "Too much?" she was saying. Her voice was a little shrill now, grating on his nerves. "I need you to listen to me, Grote. This is very important." He groaned. He couldn't listen. He couldn't bear it. He covered his ears, but somehow he could still hear her anyway. He shook his head back and forth and started to sing as loudly as he could. He could still hear her, could tell she was saying words, but couldn't hear whatever they were exactly. But she stood there, still talking, refusing to go away. He closed his eyes, her voice still humming on. What could he do? He was so tired, he just needed a rest. How could he drive her away? Confusedly, he told himself she was a mental construct. His mental construct. If he simply stopped thinking, he could drive her away. All he had to do was knock himself out and he'd be all right. There was a syringe in the drawer, a fresh needle. He had to uncover his ears to reach for it, and suddenly words were spilling louder through his head. "No, Grote," she had yelled at him. "Stop this foolishness right now. You haven't understood at all. You're going to do yourself harm." He shuddered. He needed a sedative. There it was, already on the table. "Grote," she said, "can't you see? This is what the marker wants. You're not thinking straight. Stop and listen." "Leave me alone," he mumbled. He affixed the needle and sucked the fluid up in. It was thicker than he thought. Hard to get into the needle. Still listening to his grandmother's yammering, he tied his arm off and flicked the vein, then held the needle to it. "Grote, why are you doing this?" she asked. "I just need to sleep," he said, and plunged the needle in. Just a few hours sleep. It burned going in, and then his arm began to tingle. His grandmother gave him her awful, heartbroken stare. "You think that it is a sedative?" she said. She shook her head and drew back, a look of horror on her face. "That is not what it is. You have hastened the convergence. You must hurry to the marker," she said. Surrounding the marker is a dead space that will stop this thing in you from progressing. Go there and show the others what has happened to you and warn them. You must convince them to leave the marker alone. You must try to stop the convergence before it's too late. It is urgent that you convince them, Grote. Very, very urgent." And then slowly, the painful undulating movement that was not his own, now deep within his arm. He reached out and triggered the alarm, but then found he couldn't sit still. Something was wrong. Something was already starting to change. His arm was tingling, had gone numb, and the undulating movement was larger now, had spread. He had to get out, had to see the marker, had to talk to it. The marker would save him, his grandmother had said. He rushed out and down the passage, took the spiral down. The alarm was howling, people starting to appear, confused. He stumbled through 2 laboratories he had pass cards for, then through a transparent corridor with the move and shift of the water playing on its walls. There, at the end, was the door to the markered chamber. 2 guards standing in front of it. "Let me in," he said. "Sorry, Professor Guth," said one of them. "There's an alert. Can't you hear it?" The other said in a strange voice, "What's wrong with your arm?" "I sounded the alarm. That's why I have to get in. The arm," he babbled. "I need to talk to it about the arm." "Need to talk to what?" said the first guard suspiciously. Both guards had their weapons raised. "The marker, you idiot," he said. "I need it to tell me what is going to happen to me." The 2 guards exchanged looks. One of them began talking into the comm unit very quickly. The other now actively pointed the gun at him. "Now, Professor," he said, "calm down. There's nothing to worry about." "No," he said. You don't understand. There were other people in the hall now, people behind him, watching, puzzled. All I want is to see it, he pleaded to them. What's wrong with his arm? Someone behind him asked. The arm was twisted now, his hand facing backward as if it had been cut and flipped over, then reconnected. It was not just in his arm now, but in his shoulder and chest, too. But in his shoulder and chest, too, everything changing. He tried to speak, and it came out as a deep, retching sound. The alarms were still going off. He took a step forward, and now the guard was shouting. He held his arm out in front of him, and they shrank back, moving slowly out of the way. I'll shoot, one was yelling, but he didn't shoot. Guth was at the door now, swiping his card. A bullet thudded in his leg, but it didn't matter. He hardly felt it. And then the door opened and he fell in. The chamber was empty except for him and the marker. He moved toward it, his injured leg suddenly giving out underneath him. He pulled himself along on his knees until he could touch it. Whatever was happening in his arms seemed to have stopped. It wasn't getting better, but wasn't getting worse. The marker was helping. The marker was stopping it. He breathed a sigh of relief, then winced from the stabbing pain in his leg. He would stay here, protected by the marker. Once he figured out what had happened, he could put his team to work helping him to get better. If worse came to worse, he would have the arm amputated. The alarm stopped, and he found he could think better. He would have someone move his laboratory down here, and he would continue his work. He moved his leg, winced from pain. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw the door to one side opening. He turned, recognized one of the leaders, the man who ran the guards, the one with the brutal face. What was his name again? Ah, yes, Krax. He was just the one to help move his lab, and he had brought others with him. Lots of men, healthy, strapping lads. They could all help. He was just opening his mouth to speak when Krax lifted a pistol and shot him through the forehead. That wasn't necessary, said Markov from behind him. Funny, said Krax. You never really struck me as a squeamish type. I'm not, Markov said. But his condition was worth investigating while he was still alive. Krax shrugged. Markov gave him a cool look. Give them the body to examine and watch your step, he said. Don't start assuming you're not expendable. You're more expendable now than you were 10 minutes ago. He turned on his heel and left. Krax watched him go, feeling at once a little contemptuous and a little scared, and then started out the door himself. Take the body, he said to the guards. Carry it to one of the labs and leave it there. He looked at the crowd of researchers. Which one of you has dissection experience? He asked. Nearly all of them raised their hands. He singled out 3 of them at random. Take a closer look at it and tell me what was happening to him. Then he pushed through the already disappearing crowd and left. Excuse me for a moment. Man, he put the sample in his arm. 56. Guth's body started changing shortly after the guards bundled it onto a stretcher and carried it away. But as it was hidden beneath the sheet, they didn't notice. There were strange sounds coming from it, popping and crackling sounds, which they just took for the sounds of strain in the stretcher or the scuffling of their boots in the passageway. They took it to one of the labs and slid it onto the table, the sheet still on top of it. The 3 dissectors had followed them at a distance, whispering, holding on to their icons. They filed into the room as the guards left. We should contact Field, the first of them said. He'll want to know. One of the others nodded. I'll contact him, he said, and activated the room's comlink. A strange, wet sound came from under the sheet, followed by a snap like a bone breaking. The sheet fluttered. What's that? Asked one. Just the body settling, claimed another. It didn't sound that way to me, said the first. Hello, Field, said the third into the comlink. Field's tired face appeared on the holovid. "Hideki," he said, "why are you calling me so late? What's wrong?" Another crack came from the sheet, even louder this time. The shape underneath it had changed noticeably. "What was that?" asked Field. Just a minute," said Hideki. "That's more than a body settling," said one of the others. "You're right," said the third. Slowly they moved forward. One of them reached out, tugged the sheet off, and let it fall to the floor. What lay beneath hardly looked human anymore. The head was still there, but was now embedded in a curtain of flesh, some deformations of what had once been the shoulders. It was animate, moving slightly, what was left of its chest heaving up and down with rapid movements. The legs had atrophied, and the arms had lengthened. The body had flatted, and ribs and skin lengthened. The legs had atrophied and the arms had lengthened. The body had flatted, and ribs and skin seemed to have spread out to create a wing-like structure between the wrists and what was left of the ankle. I know what this is. Like the body of a manta ray. Oh, no. It was an unhealthy, morbid color. The eyes were sunken in and had a strange gleam to them. "Professor Field, are you seeing this?" asked Hideki. "What is it?" said Field. "Oh my God," said one of the other two. There was another cracking noise, and the body changed further. What was left of the face receding, becoming lost except for the eyes and the mouth, which was now little more than a hole. It split open at the end, dissolving there into a mass of tentacles, or antenna now, almost insectoid. The hands and feet shriveled, and arms and hooks of bone sprouted in their place. It made a shrieking sound and began to struggle. Field shouted at them to run. The alarm started to sound again. Professor Hideki Ishimura fled, his only thoughts being to get as far away as possible. The other two researchers were paralyzed with fear. "Run!" Field kept yelling at them. "Run!" But they didn't move. The creature flipped itself over. It sat there, draped over the edge of the table, wheezing slightly, body bobbing up and down. One of the scientists gave a low cry and rushed for the door. The creature leapt, wrapping itself around his shoulder and face, pressing itself wettily against his face. He was screaming, and then the scream was suddenly stifled. Through the vid feed, Field watched as a strange proboscis suddenly sprouted from within, a tearing sound, and stabbed through the researcher's eye and deep into his skull. It pulsed, pumping something in. The other slid into the corner and, moaning, clenched his eyes shut. "Run!" Field screamed again, but he didn't pay any attention. The first researcher had collapsed in a heap, the creature retracting its proboscis, I can't know how to say this, proboscis, and slowly moving off him. A minute later, maybe even just seconds later, he started to change, his body beginning to shake. As Field watched, his skin changed to deep lavender, almost purple. There was a wet tearing sound, and blades of bone sprouted from his shoulder, his upper arms suddenly fading into his chest, his forearms and flexing fingers now seemingly to sprout from his stomach wall. His hair fell away, his eyes growing hollow, his ears oozing down his face to join with his neck. Slowly it stood and stumbled toward the lab door. The last scientist was still crouched in the corner, whimpering slightly. The creature that had been Guth, clumsily on the floor now, dragged itself awkwardly toward him, and then leapt. Field cut the feed so as not to have to listen to the screams. "57. He was dreaming. He was walking down an empty beach holding Ada's hand. Michael? She asked. Yes, he said. Do you love me? He didn't know how to answer, so he didn't. He loved Ada, he was sure of that. But he didn't understand how she had changed, how they had moved apart. I need you to do something for me, she said. What? He said. I want to have a baby, she said. Are you serious? He asked. She nodded. That's what I need, she said. It'll bring us closer together. And then in the dream, there began a faraway, insistent sound. At first, he hardly noticed it, but it grew louder and louder. Ada was still speaking, almost as if she didn't hear it, but he could no longer hear what she was saying. And then both she and the beach around them began to be eaten away by darkness. Slowly coming unraveled, and he woke up. The sound was still going. Someone had triggered the alarm again. He got out of bed, got quickly dressed, and went out into the hall. It was deserted. In the room behind him, he heard the comlink go live. Altman? It said. Altman, this is Field. Are you there? He went back, switched the visual on. I'm here, he said. Something's wrong, Field said. His face was bone white. I saw it, but I can't hardly believe what I saw. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. Get to safety, Altman, as quick as you can. Calm down, Field, said Altman. Tell me, what are you talking about? It sprouted swords, said Field. Just had them sprout out of its back like... Somewhere in the background came a scream. Field whirled around and Altman saw he was holding a gun. The vid clicked off. Down the hall, he heard screams. He poked his head out, saw a researcher running toward him. What's wrong? Asked Altman. Wait a minute, stop. But the man kept running. They're everywhere, he called back over his shoulder. You shoot them and they still keep coming at you. And then he was around the corner and gone. I'm still asleep, Altman thought. He closed his eyes and shook his head, and then opened his eyes again. No, as still as it had been. More screams and now even the sound of gunfire. He rushed back into his room and looked around for a weapon. Nothing there. He went out again and down the hall in the direction the man had run, walking very quickly. Rounding a corner, he saw the corridor barricaded by a laboratory table turned on its side. He headed for it. The shots rang out, thunking into the wall beside his face. Don't shoot, he cried, raising his hands above his head. It's me, Altman. A chorus of shouts, and the firing stopped. Someone from behind the table waved to him, and he moved to the table and pulled himself over it, down among them. Altman, said Showalter, I'm glad they didn't get you. Get me? Said Altman. What's going on? I don't know exactly, said Showalter, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. I've only seen one of them, but I wish I hadn't. It was monstrous. It had bone slices instead of arms and legs, and it scuttled like a spider. Its head just hung there, swinging, staring down at the floor, but it seemed to see us anyway. I don't know who it used to be, but you could tell from the remnants of clothing that used to be someone that used to be human. It sure as hell isn't human now. Something's gone horribly wrong. I gathered that, said Altman. He looked around. One of the other men was someone he vaguely recognized. White, he thought his name was. The third he didn't know. Here, said Showalter. He handed him a gun. Got this off a guard who had his head torn off. Don't know that it'll help much. When you shoot them, they don't seem to die. They just keep coming. Altman took the weapon. How many people left alive? He asked. Showalter shrugged. How do I know? The four of us counting on you, he said. Probably a few guards. There's a few others running around. Field visited me not long ago. He's still alive, said Altman. It must have started down here. Maybe it hasn't made it to the top part of the facility yet. To the part above water. Maybe not, said Showalter. Vid Field, said Altman. Tell him to get up there and seal the lock. Wait for us on the other side. We'll fight our way up once we're there. He can let us through. Showalter passed the order along to one of the other two men with him, someone called Peter Furt, who took out his holopod and got to work. From the far end of the hall came an eerie bellow, and then something shuffled around the corner. It stood roughly as tall as a man, but the arms, it had looked like the arms of a child. It had looked like the arms of a child. They protruded from its stomach, from its shoulders. From its shoulders had sprouted two joint scythes of bones, like the wings of a featherless bird. Its skin was mottled and seeping, disgusting to look at, and it smelled faintly of rotting meat. It was humanoid, but Altman wouldn't have guessed it. Had guessed it had once been human if the tattered uniform of the guard weren't still clinging to its torso. "Holy shit," whispered Altman. "Keep trying to contact field, Furt," said Showalter, keeping his voice low. "We'll hold it off. Oh, and if you can help it, men, try not to send too many bullets into the walls of the passage. Last thing we want is to be flooded out." White, Altman saw, was holding his gun so tight that his knuckles were white. The thing shuffled slowly in their direction and then stopped dead. It made a grunting sound and then, with a cry, rushed at them. "Fire!" screamed Showalter. All of three of them fired at once. The shot slowed it a little, but didn't seem to permanently harm it. It just kept coming. Altman aimed carefully for the head and fired 3 times quickly. At least 2 of the shots connected. He saw the bursts of flesh and blood as they went in, but the creature continued forward unfazed. And then it was on them, looming over the barrier. They crouched down and kept firing, trying to keep it at a distance, but with remarkable ease it leaned in through the hails of bullets and plucked up White. The man screamed and tried to run. The creature's scythes were gouging into White's back, which had already grown bloody. It pulled him close like a lover and leaned in to bite his neck. It was terrible to watch. White flopping like a fish out of water, screaming in a way Altman had only heard once before, when a rabbit had been shot in the head but lived long enough to realize it was desperately hurt. The creature was making a grotesque mumbling sound, drooling as well as biting, and shaking its head so bits of flesh and gore spattered out. Altman's first impulse was to run. The only reason he didn't was because of a fleeting, selfish thought. If I don't kill it, he thought, I'll be next. He moved as close as he could and put the gun's barrel up against the creature's neck and rattled off 4 shots. It was enough at point-blank range to tear the thing's head mostly off, to get its teeth away from White's neck. But even without the head, the body kept moving. Don't these things ever die? Shouted Altman. Showalter just grunted. He was imitating what Altman had done, holding the pistol at the joint of the scythe. He pulled the trigger and fired, and the blast tore it off. That's it, said Altman. Maim it. He brought his gun low and shot 3 times until the thing's leg collapsed, and it tilted to one side and went down, taking White with it. Altman vaulted the barrier and was on top of it. He fired and stomped on its remaining limbs, kept stomping until it was enough pieces that he didn't think it could do any damage. Even then, he wasn't sure it was dead. He was only sure that it was incapacitated enough that it couldn't hurt him. He stepped back, stunned. His shoes and legs were slick with blood. Blood splattered on his chest and arms, too. White, he saw, was still alive, but in shock. His back a bloody mass. Altman knelt down beside him and slapped his face, trying to get him to pay attention. The man's eyes flickered slightly and then clouded over. He was dead. Is he all right? Asked Showalter. Altman opened his mouth and gave him artificial respiration for a moment, trying to breathe him back to life, tasting the dead man's blood on his lips. Showalter touched his shoulder. Leave him, he said. He looked up and shook his head. He was just turning back toward the mouth when he heard a crack. saw White's torso convulse. He pushed away from it and scrambled back. The body seemed to be going through a fit, shaking and contorting, and then it began to change. Altman watched, horrified, trying to keep his panic under control. "What the hell is going on?" he said. "He's changing," said Showalter. "He's one of them now." "Let's get the fuck out of here," said Altman. "I'm afraid there's one more thing we have to do," said Showalter. "What's that?" asked Altman. "We need to take steps to make sure he doesn't come after us." Altman nodded, his lips grim. "You mean," he said, "we're going to have to dismember him." The two of them were standing together, breathing heavily, staring down at blood and gore on the floor, the pieces of the creature and of the partially transformed White. "I'll never be the same," thought Altman, and he could tell by the way Showalter dodged his gaze that he felt similarly. He'd been having nightmares before, but he had material for an entirely new set of them now. "I got through to Field," said Peter Furt. "He says, as far as he can determine, the creatures are still all in the lower levels. He'll try to get the airlock and shut it, and then wait for us to contact him. If we're going to make it, we'll need something other than guns," said Altman. "Bullets don't do enough. They barely even slow the things down." "What do you have in mind?" asked Showalter. "We raid the labs and janitorial closets as we go," said Altman. "See what we can find. Anything that'll cut off a limb or get part way there." They found in the first lab they came to a handheld plasma cutter, which, by unscrewing the guard, could be made into a close combat weapon. Showalter recalibrated a laser pistol taken off a dead guard, using the tools of the next lab to give it a wider beam, something with a little slicing power. Peter Furt dug up a laser scalpel, modified it to cut through an object as thick as his wrist. "Probably won't stop them," said Altman. "First thing I'm worried about is cutting through their sights," said Furt. "If I can't get that far, I'll be lucky." "All right," said Altman. "What do we have to lose? Let's go." Okay. It's two recognizable weapons, though the laser scalpel not so much. Okay. We're close to the end of this part. 58. "You've got 2 seconds to explain what in the living hell is going on, Krax," said Markov. He was gesturing to a series of open holovids strung over the console that showed the floating compound in chaos. Here, a table was overturned, researchers and guards alike crowded behind it. There, a man was being skewered by a strange creature that looked like a cross between a spider and the whirling blades of death. Another showed a scene of carnage, bits and pieces of bodies strewn all up and down the hallway. In another, a group of humanoid creatures lurched back and forth at a loss. Krax looked panicked. He was sweating, his eyes darting left and right. "We're being attacked. Monsters of some sort. I don't know who or what. What the fuck are they? And how did they get on board?" "I don't have any idea," said Krax. "I've never seen anything like them." "They look familiar," said Stevens. "Haven't you noticed?" "Familiar?" said Markov, and squinted at one of the vids. "Yes," he said, nodding. "I see what you mean." "That one there," said Stevens. "That used to be Molina. You can tell what's left of the face. They're all wearing bits of clothing too, scraps of it." "They used to be human?" asked Krax. Stevens nodded. "But they certainly aren't now." "What's behind it?" asked Markov. "Right now I'm debriefing Hideki Ishimura, one of our astrophysicists," said Krax. "He was the first one to witness one of them. The first one still alive anyway. But he's scared half to death. I'm not getting much out of him. He keeps saying Guth's name, though, over and over again. I thought he was babbling, but if they come from humans, maybe Guth was the first." "Hurried along, no doubt, by you shooting him in the head," said Markov. "Where's this Ishimura? I want to talk to him." "He's right here, ready to be evacuated. We have to get out of here, sir. I don't like to run from a fight, said Markov. You're not dealing with anything human, said Krax. You shoot one of these things 2 or 3 times in the head and they keep coming. You tear its head clean off and it keeps coming. That's impossible, said Markov. Krax shook his head. How can you fight that? So, a tactical retreat, said Markov. We'll get out and then regroup. I suppose there are often setbacks like this on the way to major discoveries. This is not a setback, sir, said Krax. This is a disaster. Markov gave him a hard stare. How many men, all told? 100? 2? Even with all or almost all transformed into those hideous creatures, it's not much in the grand scheme of things. Just a setback. We'll be back in operation before you know it. Are you kidding? Let's take advantage of all these camera setups set up all throughout the facility, said Markov. Set them up to transmit the escape boat. No reason we can't watch and learn. It should be very instructive. You can't possibly be thinking the marker exists, said Markov. Either we make something of it or someone else does. The loss we've had and will have are acceptable losses. I suggest we leave, sir, said Krax, voice strained. You've already made yourself clear, Mr. Krax, Markov said. Stevens and I will prepare to evacuate. I'm still considering what to do with you. You're not thinking of leaving me, are you? Indeed I am. As I told you before, you risk becoming expendable, Mr. Krax. Craig, said Stevens in a soft, pleasant voice. There's no point in leaving Krax here. He'll be much more of a help to us alive than dead. You'll not only be punishing him, but punishing us as well. Markov hesitated a moment. Always a sensible one, he said. Have you at least got a clear escape route prepared for us, Krax? I do, said Krax. We're ahead of the tide. If we leave now, we can avoid it. All right, Markov assented. Lead the way. "59. What about Markov? Asked Altman. What about him? Asked Showalter. What's he think about all this? I don't know, said Showalter. Been trying to contact him off and on for quite a while. Nothing doing. Dead, maybe? I'd be surprised, said Altman. They were traveling through a sequence of laboratories, moving first into the control station and then through the safety door into the lab itself. They had seen a few more of the creatures, but had succeeded in dodging all but 2 of them, which they'd managed to carve up without losses. The first lab had been normal, nothing to worry about. But as soon as he opened the door to this one, Altman knew something was different. Something was off. And then he saw it, growing out of one of the air ducts and spilling onto the floor with a strange mass of tissue. It had spread along the floor itself, had seemingly become a part of it. He gestured at it with his cutter. It's starting to get around, he said, spreading through the vents. A few seconds later, the light flickered and went out, leaving only the emergency lighting on. The room was now cast in a thick shadow. They're getting to the power grid now, said Showalter. We'd better hurry. They were almost to the door to the next lab when they heard a scuttling in the vents above them. The grill just above them was kicked out, and something fell down onto the deck, just missing them. It was formless and pulsing, a kind of mound that at times stretched flat and looked a little more like a puddle. It slowly slid across the deck. As it crossed the floor, it left a sizzling stain inflicted on the deck itself. Anything it touched was either sucked in or disappeared, or was stripped to bare metal. In the slow roll of it, Altman glimpsed from time to time a human skull, stripped to bone, and even once what looked like a laughing human face. How do you cut the limbs off something that doesn't have any limbs? Asked Furt. Slowly moved toward them, attracted perhaps by the vibration of their voices or propelled by some other means. It wasn't aggressive. It seemed to have another purpose. As it eased them back, making them feel trapped, Altman began to wonder what it was. It stripped the deck bare, got rid of all features. Transfixed, he couldn't help but watch, thinking they were finally out of time. It destroyed everything in its wake, living or dead. And he wouldn't be surprised if, and when it did, it grew. How big would it get? Were there any limits? Would it consume the entire world? We should go back, Showalter said. Altman nodded, and they started back towards the door they had come from. Furt was just about to open it, but Altman stopped him. Not yet, he whispered. Heard something. He pressed his ear to the door's panel. Yes, definitely something out there, just on the other side of the door. And from the scrapping and moaning sound, he was pretty certain it wasn't human. What now? Altman wondered, his eyes casting around the room for something to get them out. Maybe they could leap the creature and run around it. Maybe they should simply leave the room and start firing at whatever was outside, trying to incapacitate it before the creatures caught up with them and engulfed them. And then he realized Furt was pointing and gesturing. There, just shy of the edge of the creeper, was a hydrogen tank, a torch screwed around its nozzle. Altman reached out and grabbed it, dragging it back with him. He spun the nozzle as open as it would go, sparked the torch alight, and adjusted it to give him the longest spurt of flame possible. He dipped it down near the floor and sprayed the creeper. Where the flame touched it, it caught fire, burning and bubbling black. Elsewhere, the creeper withdrew from the flames, trying to get away. He moved forward, spraying it, coughing in the acrid smoke it raised. Even where it was black and burning, it didn't stop moving exactly, the burnt portions folding under into the core and disappearing. But at least it was moving in the other direction now. I can hold it at bay, he called to Showalter and Furt, but I can't get rid of it. Furt had just started to respond when the door crashed in. Still waving the torch, Altman glanced over his shoulder to see Furt lopping off a scythe with his laser scalpel. Showalter was backing away, firing the laser pistol steadily, a half dozen of the shambling things coming at him with steady blade-like arms. Furt was in the middle of them, surrounded on all sides, doing his best to cut his way free, but there were too many. Altman watched as one of them plunged its face into Furt's neck. Furt, screaming, tried to pry it off and finally did, knocking it back and cutting into its mouth with the laser scalpel, but another was instantly in its place. Furt was screaming. A moment later, his head had been torn free, his decapitated body collapsing onto the deck. Two were down. Another was crippled, one arm and one leg inoperative, but it still dragged itself forward, hissing. Showalter stomped on it. That left three. Altman gave the creeper a last blast and turned, dragging the cutter out. One was just bringing its bony scythe down, whistling towards Showalter's back, but the cutter caught it in time, shaving the appendage off close to the body. Another scythe tore a gash in his arm, and he almost dropped the cutter. Cursing, he managed to hold onto it and slice the creature's leg out from under it. A laser blast flashed by his head and left the arm of the last one half disarticulated, but with a cry it sprang forward, brushing past Altman and charging at Showalter. The latter stumbled back, his laser pistol going off and singeing the wall. Together, Showalter and the creature fell, toppling backwards and into the creeper. Altman immediately fired up the torch and rushed forward, but it was too late. Showalter was engulfed and simply gone, part of the pulsating, shifting mass. Weirdly enough, it did the same thing to the creature, engulfing it just as quickly and dramatically, swallowing one of its own. He stomped on one of the creatures that was still moving, and then laid down a blast of flame along the creeper's side. It withdrew, moving back enough to allow him to sidle past and out the door. Just me now, he thought. Down to one. It was hard not to feel that there was no point going forward. It was inevitable. One of them would catch him, tear him apart. But he kept going. He was limping now, though he wasn't sure why. He wasn't exactly sure why. Not sure what had happened to his leg. He bandaged his arm with a first aid kit from the lab, stopping every once in a while to drive the creeper back with the torch. He'd been lucky, creeping through half dark of the emergency lights. He'd met 5 of the blade creatures since Fert and Showalter had died, never in sets of more than 2, never in a place where one could get around behind him while the other tore him up from the front. The single one had been easy, but the pairs had been harder, and he couldn't help thinking when it was all over that if the cutter had just gone a little high or a little low, one of the creatures would have sunk its maws into his neck, and that would have been the end of him. And then he saw Ada. She contacted him by holovid, a static, thick message. "Michael," she said, "are you there?" "Ada, is that you?" "I'm here," she said. "I'm safe now, but I don't know what they're going to do with me. If you get this, please hurry, Michael." "Ada, where are you?" Altman said. But she didn't seem to be listening. She reached out beneath the camera, and the image flickered and shortened out, then began again. "Michael, are you there?" she said. A recording then, being rebroadcast over and over. Still, it was enough. Just enough to get him going again. As he moved higher in the facility, he saw fewer of the creatures. Those he did see, he either hid from or killed as silently as he could, trying to avoid attracting the attention of the others. Nevertheless, he was surprised when he realized that he was one hallway shy of the airlock. Suddenly he began to believe he might make it out alive after all. There was only one problem. He almost walked straight into the creature assembled from not just one corpse, but several. It looked like a spider, but with the scythe-like appendages of other creatures serving as legs, 7 of them in all. The body proper consisted of overlapped and buckled torsos awkwardly melding with one another. 2 heads dangled weakly at one end as if ready to drop off. He hid partly behind the doorframe, furtively examining it. On its underside was a pulsing yellow and black lump, maybe a tumor of some kind. Rush forward, start cutting, he thought. Not much of a plan, but it was all he could think of. He stayed for a long moment, hesitating, and then taking a deep breath, rushed out and at it. It immediately turned to face him and hissed. It scuttled toward him, the tip of its bone-like appendages thunking against the tunnel floors. But before he'd gone close enough to hit it with the cutter, something unsettling happened. One of the heads that had been dangling loose scrambled to the top of the body and launched itself at him. It struck him in the chest, wrapping a set of sinewy tendrils around his neck. It started to squeeze. Holy hell, he thought. He stumbled back, trying desperately to pry it off. The spider thing was still coming, still scuttling forward, its other head alert and on top of its body now as well. He struck the one already on him hard enough with the side of the cutter again and again. It loosened just a little, enough that he could breathe, and he forced his hand in between it and his neck and tore it off. It tried to crawl up his arm and back to his neck, but he held it tight by its withering tendrils and didn't let go. The other head launched itself at him, and he batted it down to the ground with the first head stamping. The other head launched itself at him, and he batted it down to the ground with the first head, stabbing it to a pulp. The head in his hand he slammed into the wall, then cut in half with the plasma cutter. The rest of the spider thing was on him now. He sliced off the tip of one appendage, and it reared back on its 3 hind legs and struck at him with the remaining 4. He managed to parry 2 of them successfully and dodged the third. The fourth, having just lost its tip to the plasma cutter, struck him hard but bluntly in the chest. He fell to the floor, the wind knocked out of him. Then he was beneath it as it danced about, trying to skewer him. He cut off one leg, then another, but it didn't seem to hurt its balance. He kicked it hard and knocked it back and scrambled back himself, and then, knowing it would do little good just to buy time, he whipped out the plasma pistol and started firing. The shots flashed off its leg or entered the flesh of the body with a hiss, but hardly seemed to slow it. It was nearly over him again, and when he kicked it back with both feet this time, succeeded in turning it off balance and flipping it over. As it struggled to right itself, he saw again the pulsing yellow and black lump. He fired at it. The lump exploded, the blast knocking him back through the doorway, deafening him. Bits of the creature struggled about, including one whole enough to come at him. He stood, stumbled toward it, sectioned it with the plasma cutter. The blaster had stressed the corridor, covering the walls with hairline cracks. Stumbling up, he inspected it for leaks. For now, it seemed to be holding. Limping, still deafened, he moved to the end of the corridor and pounded on the airlock. No answer. "It's Altman," he called. "Let me through." When there was still no answer, he realized there was an easier way and established a comlink to Field through his holopad. Immediately, the airlock slid open and he stumbled through. "Altman," said Field. He was clutching his marker icon tight in one hand, closing the airlock behind him with the other. "Thank the marker. I had just about given up hope." "Where's Ada?" was the first question Altman asked. "What do you mean?" asked Field. "Still confined to the mainland, I presume. I haven't seen her in days." "But I saw her," said Altman. "I saw her vid. She was right here." "I'm sorry," said Field. "I haven't seen her." Maybe it was the marker, he thought. But how could that be? The marker only showed dead people, but Ada wasn't dead. And then his blood froze as he realized what he had known ever since he dreamt of her earlier. Ada was dead. Field grabbed his arm. "We have to go," said Field. "I don't know how long we'll be able to keep them contained." "Where's Markov?" Altman asked. "I don't know," said Field. "I think he might have packed up and left. Either that or he's dead. Doesn't matter much to me either way." Altman nodded. "We'll have to come back, said Field. "What?" said Altman. We need to go get help and come back. We have to make sure this is contained. We have to protect the marker." Altman followed him away from the airlock and upward through a series of open chambers and then around a curving corridor to the main dome. They got on the lift and prepared to take it to the top, but it didn't move. "What's wrong?" asked Altman. Field shook his head. "Apparently the lift won't run on auxiliary power," he said. "We'll have to climb." "After you." Altman slung the cutter over his back and started up the access ladder. Field right behind him. It was a narrow climb, not much room between the ladder and the wall, and it quickly became an arduous one as well. Already exhausted by what he'd just been through, Altman found he had to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Behind him, Field wasn't doing much better. He was wheezing like he was about to pass out. "Everything okay, Field?" Altman called down. "I'll live," said Field. He started to say something further, then made a choking sound and was suddenly cut off. Altman glanced down and saw that Field was being choked by something that looked like a whitish-gray snake or a length of intestine. One end was curled tight around the ladder, the other tight around his throat. Field was scrabbling at his throat with one hand, trying to hold onto the ladder with the other. Altman started down toward him, shouting, while Field let go of the ladder, both hands on the strangler now. Altman was still clambering down, just heaving the cutter off his back, when almost ready to cut the thing in two. But Field wasn't holding the ladder. If he cut through the creature, Field would fall. "Field," he cried, "grab hold of the ladder." But Field didn't seem to hear him. His face was purple now, and Altman saw that blood was leaking slowly from his ears. Altman stretched down and stamped on the end of the strangler holding onto the ladder. It squirmed beneath his foot but didn't let go. At the other end, it gave a low, wrenching jerk, and Field's head popped off like a grape, thunking down to the floor below. The body knocked against the wall, and the ladder swiftly followed it. He watched the strangler slither down, moving swiftly and sinuously. When it reached the bottom, it moved in twisting, undulating motions until it reached Field's headless corpse. He watched it prod its stomach, and then one end of it narrowed to a point, and it stabbed through the skin. Slowly, throbbing, it forced itself into Field's belly. The belly swelled and slowly distended, until with a last wriggle the creature had disappeared entirely. Altman felt sick. He clung to the ladder a moment, staring down. He might have hung up there for longer, but then a thought occurred to him. There might be more of them. Glancing nervously about him, he forced himself to continue up the ladder. When he reached the hatch, he opened it and clambered out onto the deck, making sure it was securely closed behind him. He hoped the creature wouldn't be capable of opening it, but he didn't know for sure. He started clambering down the side of the dome, following the narrow steps cut in the glass. Below was the boat platform slopping up and down with the swells. Most of the boats were gone, but one was left. He undid the mooring and climbed in. The motor started immediately. Only then did it start to seem real, like he might actually get away, like he might actually survive. And then he remembered Field, dead because he had waited for Altman. "We'll have to come back," Field had said. "Make sure it's contained." "No," thought Altman. "I'm free of it. I'm not going back." And then suddenly he felt a presence in the boat, beside him, just behind him, just out of sight. He was afraid if he turned he would see Field, his head loose in place but not connected to his neck, threatening to fall off at any moment. "Hello, Altman," someone said. "Leave me alone, Field," Altman said. "Are you coming back for me?" Only when he thought of it, it didn't seem exactly like Field's voice. "You're dead, Field. I can't come back for you." "But what about me?" it said. Definitely not Field's voice. It was the voice of a woman now. He turned his head, saw Ada. "Where are you, Ada? Who killed you?" "I'm right here. I need you, Michael," she said. "I need you to finish what you started." He shook his head. "You're not Ada," he said. "You're a hallucination." "It's not finished, Michael. Everyone is in grave danger. You have to stop the convergence." "What is convergence?" he asked. "You've seen the convergence," Ada said. "You need to stop it." And then she disappeared. He put the boat in gear and pushed the throttle down hard. Damned if he could figure out what exactly she wanted from him. What it wanted from him. "I'm not going back," he told himself. "I'm not going back." But he already was afraid he would. God, I'm gonna try and go. Is this a video or a live stream? This is a live stream. I'm very close to finishing this end of part 6. 60. When he landed at the docks in Chicxulub, someone was waiting for him. Chava, the boy who had told Ada and him about the body on the beach. He was standing there in the dim light, shivering. Beside him was a town drunk who had lost his name. "I knew you were coming," said Chava, as Altman tied the boat off. "The Burja told me. She is dead, and yet she told me. She has asked me to tell you that you must go back." "I don't want to go back," he said. "You must," said Chava, his eyes innocent and sincere. "She needs you." "And why are you here?" said Altman to the drunk. He wasn't drunk now, or at least didn't appear to be so. He crossed his fingers and made the sign of the devil's tail. "The only way to beat the devil," the man told him, "is to take the devil inside you. You must open yourself to the devil. You must learn to think like the devil." "I don't have time for this," said Altman. "I need to find help." "Yes," said Chava. "We will come with you." He left the docks and set off, the old man and the boy following him. When it became clear that he was heading towards the Dredger Corp compound, Chava hurried to catch up, tried to hold him back. "You will find no help there," he said. He shook the boy off and kept going, heading for the gate. When he looked back, he saw the boy and the old man had stopped, were standing motionless in the dusty road. "We will wait for you here," the boy called after him. He tried his card on the gate and it opened. He crossed the stretch of empty ground to the compound and tried the card on the door without result. Excuse me. He knocked, pressed the buzzer, then waited. For a moment there was nothing, and then the vid panel next to his face flashed on to show a wavery black and white image of Terry. He stared at Altman, pushing his glasses back on his nose. "I'd like to come in," said Altman. "I'm sorry," said Terry. "No admins for anybody at the moment." "It's important," said Altman. "Something's gone wrong with the facility," he said. "We need to do something about it." He heard the sound of someone speaking, a voice too low to make out, just outside the frame. Terry turned his head and looked off screen. "It's one of them," he said to someone on his left. "I don't know which one. I don't remember his name. Alter, I think." He was silent, the other voice rumbling. "Yeah, that's it," he said. "Altman." He listened intently, then turned back to Altman. "You can come in," he said. "Who are you talking to?" asked Altman. "Nobody," he said. "Don't worry about that." "I need to know I'll be safe," he said. "You'll be safe," said Terry, after a moment's hesitation. But by the way he looked sideways as he said it, Altman knew he was lying. He had almost reached the outer gate by the time Terry opened the door. He kept going, not even turning around. "Wait a minute," asked Terry. "Where are you going?" "Sorry," said Altman. "Can't stay." "I've got a gun," said Terry. "Don't make me shoot you." Altman stopped. "Now be a good boy and turn around and come back," said Terry. He did. He turned slowly and went back. Terry held his gun casually, almost desultorily. I'll have to look that up later. The safety, Altman noted, was off. "What's that you're holding?" he asked, glancing down at the plasma cutter. "What's this about?" said Altman. "First I can't come in, and then you're insisting I come in?" "Orders," said Terry. "You're to come inside and stay put." He gestured to the plasma cutter. "I think you'd better drop it," he said. "Whose orders?" Terry just shrugged. "I don't want to come in," Altman said, moving slightly forward. "There's something I need to finish first." "And I don't want to shoot you," said Terry. "But I will. Drop that thing and put your hands up." Suddenly the gate started to rattle. Someone banging on it. Terry's eyes flicked toward it just for a moment, just long enough for Altman to lunge and knock the gun to one side. It fired, the bullet sparking off the fence, but Terry didn't drop it. Indeed, was already starting to bring it back to bear on him. Altman flicked the plasma cutter on and flashed it toward him in the same movement. An energy blade sliced through his forearm, the gun in the hand holding it tumbling to the ground. For a moment, Terry was too shocked to realize what had happened. He just stood there, unable to figure out what had happened to his arm. And then it hit him. Eyes wide, he stepped back and took in a deep breath to scream. Altman, not knowing what else to do, ran, trying not to hear the screams of the man behind him. He darted out the gate and was joined by Chava, who ran alongside him. "I came and knocked for you," he said, And now you come. A good thing you did too, said Altman. Where's the old man? El borracho, el borracho, said Chava. He had to go. He was thirsty. He started back down the street, the boy following him. What now? He turned and crouched beside the boy. I had to destroy some devils, he said, like the thing you saw on the beach. I will help you, said Chava. Together we will kill them. No, said Altman. It is not a game. You cannot come. I must find weapons and go alone. The boy thought a moment and then smiled. You will come with me, he said. Follow. The boy led him down through the streets and to the shanty town, and then to the edge of the jungle. He went to a particular tree and put his hand on it, and then carefully pointed himself in a particular direction, and stiff-legged started to walk, pounding his footsteps hard against the ground. When the sounds of his footsteps changed, he stopped. Here, he said. He pointed at the ground. He crouched and began to brush the dirt away until he had uncovered a steel ring and a wooden trapdoor about 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. He gestured to Altman to open it. He put the plasma cutter on the ground and reached down and pulled on the ring. The door creaked up on its hinge, revealing underneath it a coffin-like space lined with rocks. One half was full of guns and rifles, maybe a dozen in all. The others held axes and mauls, tree spikes, a machete, a can of fuel, and an old-style chainsaw. You may use these, said the boy solemnly, but you must bring them back. They belong to my father. What exactly does your father do? He asked. He is for the people. He is... For a moment, he couldn't think of the words, and then it suddenly came to him. Ecological guerrilla. Thank God for tree huggers, said Altman. He took the chainsaw, left the rest where it was, though this confused the boy. These monsters, he asked, wide-eyed, they are trees? At first, Altman thought to answer him properly, but when he started speaking, he suddenly realized how complicated the response would be. He just nodded and said, yes, trees. But this created new complications. How can trees be monsters? The boy wanted to know. It's hard to explain, said Altman. And what kind of tree? He asked. He began to rattle off Spanish tree names, following Altman. Altman ignored him. He was almost back to the boat, the boy still following him, when this holopod sounded. When he answered, Crack's face appeared on the holoscreen. Altman, he said. Hello. He switched off. Crax called again immediately. He thought of not answering, but he knew Crax would just keep calling until he did. So he answered, but this time he kept walking. This thing you did to Terry, said Crax. Hardly subtle. I could have you arrested. Somehow I don't think you're going to do that, said Altman. Probably not, he admitted. But I have to say, I think you overreacted. We just wanted to talk to you. You didn't just wanted to talk to me. You wanted to keep me there. It's for your own good. Don't do anything foolish, Altman. Come back. No, said Altman. What about your girlfriend, Altman? He said. What about Ada? Would you come back for her? Altman stopped. Put her on, he said. For the first time, Crack's composure cracked slightly. She's not available right now, he said. You can't because she's dead, said Altman. Don't be ridiculous, Altman. Why would she be dead? I started hallucinating her, said Altman. Either you killed her, or she killed herself. Which was it, Crax? Hallucinations don't mean anything, Crax insisted. She's alive. Altman started moving again. Show her to me then, said Altman. If I see her, I'll come back. As I said Crax, that's not possible. You'll just have to trust me. Your girlfriend's life is in your hands. He was at the dock now. Goodbye, Crax, Altman said, and disconnected, powering the holopod all the way off. He lowered the gear into the boat and climbed in himself. Chava tried to clamber in, but Altman stopped him. Stay here, he said. I already have enough deaths on my conscience. There's no water in this. 61. As he navigated the boat through the swells and felt the spray on his face, there was a lot of time to think. I'm crazy, he thought at first. I shouldn't be going back. I was lucky to escape alive the first time. Indeed, he might have stayed on land if Ada hadn't been dead. But no. As it was, there was no reason to go back to land. He felt he had to end it. And then he began to think of what the old drunk had said when he met him on the dock. The only way to beat the devil is to take the devil inside you. You must open yourself to the devil. You must learn to think like the devil. And how would the devil think? Or how, in this case, would the marker think? If anyone would know, Altman thought, it would be him. He had seen the marker many times, had survived close proximity to it even when it was broadcasting fully. He had spoken to him by way of hallucinations again and again. What had it said most recently, through his memories of Ada? I need you, Michael. I need you to finish what you started. That was vague, like most of what the ghosts told him. It was hard to pin down. Earlier in the dream, it had been much more specific, but it was really the marker speaking to him through the dream. Or was it only a dream? Or even something else? A dream was a far cry from hallucination. But maybe the dream was his subconscious mind trying to tell him something. What exactly had Ada said? I need you to do something for me, she had said. I want to have a baby. That's what I need. It'll bring us closer together. But it was a dream, the same thing as was a dream the same thing as a hallucination? Maybe it was a different force altogether. Maybe not his subconscious at all, but something else. What did she mean by having a baby? Were these creatures, the crewmen that had been transformed after death into monsters, the marker's offsprings? Well, yes, he supposed so, in their manner of speaking. If he was right in thinking they'd been created by the marker's transmitted code, but unless he was mistaken, his dream about Ada had not raised the issue with him until after the creatures, whatever they were, had been spawned. Indeed, he must have had the dream just after the creatures had appeared, even though Altman hadn't known about them until a few minutes later, when the alarm woke him up. Maybe he should take the dream literally. Maybe that was exactly what the marker was demanding of them, that they reproduce it. Maybe if he could convince the marker that he understood that he could reproduce it, things would return to normal. It was simple, he thought, and then doubts assailed him. Was he basing it all on a dream? And it didn't jibe perfectly with what his hallucination had been telling him. It could mean nothing, or even something else. Another force trying to manipulate him. It was almost too simple. And even if he was right, who was to say that if he did what the marker wanted, things would go back to normal? Maybe they would just get worse. What if the marker had no stake whatsoever in the survival of the human species, but saw humans only as a means to an end? If that end is fulfilled, he thought, will it still need us? Or will it crush us, almost without thinking, as if we were flies? What if we were trapped between a rock and a hard place, he wondered. What if humanity is going to die either way? He shook his head. It was the best he could come up with. He'd have to take a chance. But what choice he would make, what he'd choose to risk, he didn't know. Altman's wager, he thought. In any case, the marker was the key. There was no choice but to return to the marker, no matter what stood in the way. It was nearly dark now. There, up ahead, were the lights of the floating compound, dim, running on the emergency backpack, running on the emergency backup, but still there. Soon he would be there as well. Soon he'd either have his answers or he'd be dead. Okay. So there is one last chapter which actually might be significantly smaller. It's hard to say. I think it is a chapter in an epilogue, though. Again, hard to say. Yeah, chapter and epilogue. So yeah, one more for the cold read of Dead Space Martyr. And then my voice can finally have some rest. So hopefully I can get that tomorrow. Either way, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya. My throat. Water.